The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, but the smell. Raw earth, violated. Diesel fumes hanging heavy in the late afternoon air, a greasy shroud over what used to be my sanctuary. Then, the visual. Half my front yard just gone, erased. My custom-built greenhouse, a delicate lattice work of glass and dreams, now a jagged wound of shattered panes and twisted metal. My grandmother's heirloom roses, painstakingly cultivated from cuttings she'd brought over from the old country, lineage stretching back generations, flattened, their velvet petals crushed into the mud beneath the indifferent steel treads of a parked backhoe. A grotesque yellow monument to trespass, its maw still caked with the remnants of my life's work. Fury, cold and pure, sluiced through me, a sudden Arctic current in the summer heat. This wasn't just damage, this was desecration. I stood there, briefcase slipping from numb fingers, the neat, suburban street, suddenly, a battlefield. Why? The question throbbed with a primal beat. There had been no warning, no letter, no whisper of impending doom. Just this brutal, inexplicable demolition. The silence of the street was a mockery, the chirping birds oblivious to the savagery. My gaze fixed on the backhoe, an alien invader on my sovereign soil. They had crossed a line that didn't just define property, but personhood. And in that moment, something within me, long dormant, began to uncoil. They would learn, with surgical precision, the exact nature of their mistake. They had, quite simply, picked the wrong lawn. The HOA president, a man named Arthur Henderson, whose face always seemed perpetually pinched in disapproval, arrived with the unctuous self-importance of a minor despot. He surveyed the ruin with an air that suggested I was somehow inconveniencing him. "Ah, there you are," he'd said, as if I were late for my own execution. His voice, a reedy tenor, grated. Regrettable, of course, but necessary. Necessary? I repeated the word, my own voice dangerously calm, a stillness before a seismic event. He waved a dismissive hand towards the mangled remains of my greenhouse. Your structure and the unapproved botanical arrangements were in clear violation of Green Space Guideline 7.3b. We sent a crew to rectify the situation. He had the audacity to look self-congratulatory. Green Space Guideline 7.3b. It sounded official. It sounded final. It also sounded like utter fabrication. My blood, which had been a frozen river, began to simmer. The personal violation was a gaping wound, but the casual, almost gleeful citation of non-existent authority, that was the salt. That was the insult he couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of. He saw a disgruntled homeowner. He saw, perhaps, tears, maybe a shouted threat. He didn't see the gears turning behind my eyes, the slow, methodical cataloging of his every word, every micro-expression of his smug, delusional confidence. He thought he held all the cards, that his little fiefdom was impenetrable. He had no idea he was standing on the precipice of his own meticulously orchestrated downfall, having just handed me the shovel to dig his political grave. The air crackled with unspoken declarations. He was about to learn about due process from someone who didn't just understand it but wielded it. They didn't know. That was the crux of it, the beautiful, terrible irony. They saw a woman, a resident, perhaps a little too fond of her roses. They didn't see the years spent dissecting municipal codes, the countless hours in zoning board meetings, the quiet satisfaction of drafting legislation that shaped the very ground they stood on. I am not just a homeowner. I am a land use attorney. The local zoning laws? I didn't just know them. I had helped write significant portions of them, my fingerprints all over the nuanced language they so casually sought to pervert. Henderson's Green Space Guideline 7.3b was a phantom, a figment of his overreaching imagination. My garden, every rosebush, every carefully placed stone, complied meticulously with every actual ordinance. As I stood there, the initial shock wave of grief for my lost plants began to recede, replaced by a cold, crystalline purpose. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. This was about the abuse of power, the casual tyranny of a petty dictator in a golf shirt. My mind, trained for legal combat, began to whir. This wouldn't be a shouting match over a fence. This would be a systematic dismantling. The heirloom roses, a legacy from my grandmother, became a symbol. They had tried to uproot my history, my peace. In return, I would uproot their entire rotten structure. My home office, usually a place of calm contemplation over contracts and easements, transformed into a war room. The first target, the HOA's own governing documents. They had declared war. They just didn't know their opponent was already armed, fortified, and intimately familiar with the terrain. My paralegal, Sarah, a woman whose ability to unearth obscure documents bordered on the supernatural, answered on the first ring. "I need everything you can find on the Oakwood Estates HOA," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor that still echoed in my chest. Bylaws, covenants, conditions, restrictions, meeting minutes from the last 5 years, financials, the works. And Sarah, I added, a sliver of ice in my tone, prioritize anything related to landscaping contracts and capital expenditure approvals. She didn't ask why. Sarah knew that tone. It was the tone I used when righteous fury had been distilled into tactical resolve. While she dove into the digital abyss, I began my own reconnaissance. The HOA's website was a monument to amateur design and bureaucratic opacity, but the minutes, once downloaded, told a story. Vague resolutions, rubber-stamped approvals, and Henderson's name appearing with unnerving frequency. The green space guidelines were, as suspected, nowhere to be found. Not in the bylaws, not in the CC, ours, not in any addendum. It was a ghost rule, conjured to justify an atrocity. Then, a flicker of something interesting in the financial statements. A recurring, significantly large payment to Henderson's Premium Landscaping. The name was a little too on the nose, even for Arthur. A quick search confirmed my suspicion. The proprietor? One Barry Henderson, Arthur's cousin, twice removed and thrice bankrupt, apparently. The tendrils of this petty corruption were already beginning to surface, and my grip on them tightened. This wasn't just negligence. It was looking increasingly like a coordinated grift. The air in my office grew colder. The next target was the city's planning department, my old stomping ground. I knew the chief clerk, a meticulous woman named Carol, who had seen every kind of permit application, legitimate and otherwise. Eleanor Vance, I announced myself, foregoing pleasantries. I need to see all permits issued for work at 12 Willow Creek Lane and any associated HOA common area permits for the last year. Carol, ever efficient, had the files pulled within the hour. I spread the documents across a vacant counter, the crinkle of paper, a familiar symphony. The work order for the destruction of my garden was there, a flimsy piece of paper authorizing vegetation removal and site remediation. The authorizing signature? Arthur Henderson, HOA President. The city permit attached to it, however, was for emergency drainage easement clearing. My property had no such easement. The permit number looked off. I cross-referenced it in the city's online portal. Invalid. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. The official stamp was slightly blurred, the font a near miss but not an exact match. They hadn't just lied. They'd committed fraud. The landscaping contract with Henderson's Premium Landscaping, which Sarah had emailed over with a subject line simply reading bingo, was even more egregious. Inflated rates, vague service descriptions, and an automatic renewal clause that would make a loan shark blush. The misuse of HOA funds wasn't just a possibility, it was documented in black and white, signed with the same arrogant flourish as the fraudulent permit. The net wasn't just tightening, it was closing. Every document was a nail in Henderson's coffin. The initial barrage was purely legal, delivered with the impersonal chill of certified mail. A cease and desist letter to the HOA board, detailing the trespass, destruction of property, and the fraudulent permit, demanding immediate cessation of any further actions and full restitution. Copies were sent to the city attorney's office, with a cover letter highlighting the permit fraud, and to the district attorney, noting potential criminal charges. I enclosed a meticulously compiled evidence binder, photographs of the devastation, copies of my property survey clearly showing no relevant easements, the forged permit, the HOA's non-existent guideline, and the suspect landscaping contract. My demands were simple: full, itemized accounting of the costs for the destruction, immediate termination of the contract with Henderson's Premium Landscaping, and a formal proposal for the complete restoration of my garden to my exact specifications at the HOA's expense. I also formally requested all documentation related to the approval of this action, citing specific clauses in the HOA bylaws regarding member rights and due process, clauses I knew they had flagrantly violated. The silence from Henderson was, for a few days, deafening. I imagined the flurry of panicked calls, the dawning realization that they hadn't just poked a bear, they dynamited its den. The tactical operations were proceeding as planned. Each legal document was a precisely aimed shot, designed to dismantle their defenses and expose their vulnerabilities. My home, my sanctuary, had been violated. Now, their flimsy fortress of lies was about to crumble. The shift in Henderson's demeanor, when he finally called, was palpable. The smug condescension was gone, replaced by a quavering, blustering defensiveness. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice an octave higher than usual, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. A clerical error, perhaps." I let the silence stretch, a cold, dead space on the line. "Mr. Henderson," I replied, my tone as flat and unyielding as a concrete slab, "the only misunderstanding is your apparent belief that you operate above the law. The destruction of my property was not a clerical error. It was a malicious act, supported by fraudulent documents. The city attorney's office is now quite interested in your definition of clerical error when it pertains to forged permits." I could almost hear him sweating through the phone. He stammered about a special board meeting, about wanting to resolve this amicably. Amicably? After they'd bulldozed a piece of my soul? The deadpan sarcasm was a luxury I allowed myself in that moment. "Amicable resolution, Mr. Copper. Henderson, begins with your resignation and the full, unconditional acceptance of all terms outlined in my letter dated July 17th. Until then, consider all communication to be on the record and potentially discoverable." I hung up. The days that followed were filled with the soft hum of my printer churning out affidavits. Several neighbors, previously cowed by Henderson's reign, found their courage when presented with the undeniable evidence of his malfeasance. Their stories, detailing other instances of overreach, painted a broader picture of systemic abuse. The silent majority was finding its voice, fueled by my initial strike. The law enforcement ally in this scenario was the city's own legal department, now officially investigating the permit issue, a quiet, bureaucratic engine of justice I had set in motion. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that suddenly felt like a courtroom. Henderson sat at the head table, flanked by the other, visibly uncomfortable board members. He looked smaller, diminished, the swagger replaced by a pallor that even the harsh fluorescent lighting couldn't entirely account for. I sat in the front row, a single, formidable file folder in my lap. The air was thick with anticipation. When the floor was opened for homeowner concerns, I rose. "Mr. Henderson, board members," I began, my voice carrying easily in the hushed room. "On July 15th, my property was unlawfully entered and significantly damaged by a crew operating under the direction of this HOA, specifically Mr. Henderson." I laid out the facts one by one, with the surgical precision of a prosecutor. The destruction. The fabricated Green Space Guideline 7.3b. The forged city permit. The questionable landscaping contract awarded to Henderson's cousin. With each point, I produced a document, a photograph, an affidavit, projecting copies onto the screen behind the board. Zoom-ins on the forged signature. Drone surveillance images I'd commissioned showing the extent of the damage. Text messages from other residents, previously suppressed, detailing Henderson's bullying. His attempts to interrupt, to bluster about HOA prerogatives and misinterpretations, were met with a cold, unwavering recitation of facts and legal statutes. The dramatic lighting change was the slow drain of color from his face as the weight of evidence crushed his defenses. The public reckoning was in full swing, and he was its unwilling star. The fallout was swift and brutal. Henderson's attempts to defend the indefensible dissolved into incoherent ramblings under the weight of the presented evidence and the increasingly hostile questions from the assembled homeowners. By the end of the meeting, a vote of no confidence was passed. He was removed, effective immediately. The remaining board members, faces ashen, quickly moved to accept all my demands: full financial restitution, termination of the illicit landscaping contract, and a public apology. An interim board was appointed, tasked with overseeing a complete audit of HOA finances and a review of all existing contracts and procedures. The city attorney's office, having received my comprehensive evidence package, launched its own formal investigation into permit fraud and potential embezzlement by Henderson and his cousin. News of the Oakwood Estates uprising, as one local blog dramatically dubbed it, spread. My porch light, which had felt dimmed by the violation, seemed to burn brighter. The moral cost of his actions was being tallied, not in dollars, but in public disgrace and the dismantling of his petty empire. The fence around my property, metaphorically breached, was now being rebuilt with the stronger material of community resolve and legal precedent. My victory wasn't just personal. It was a restoration of order, a clear message that power, unchecked, inevitably corrupts, and that sometimes the quietest neighbor holds the biggest stick. They had learned that the pen, especially when wielded by a land use attorney with a vendetta, is indeed mightier than the bulldozer. The reconstruction of my garden began the following week, paid for in full by the chastened HOA. Not by Henderson's Premium Landscaping, of course. Their contract had been voided on grounds of fraudulent inducement. I selected a master gardener, renowned for her work with heritage plants. Each new rosebush, each pane of glass in the rebuilt greenhouse, was a testament to resilience. The scent of fresh soil, this time turned with care and respect, filled the air. My grandmother's roses, from new, healthy stocks sourced from a specialist nursery that understood their lineage, were planted with reverence. It wasn't just a garden, it was a statement. A symbol of boundaries reasserted, of justice cultivated from the wreckage of arrogance. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before stopped by, not just to admire the returning beauty, but to offer quiet thanks for breaking Henderson's hold. The silent majority had found its voice, and the neighborhood felt lighter, freer. My home was once again my sanctuary, the psychological closure settling in like the evening dew. There was a somber satisfaction in it, a cold, calculated vengeance that had blossomed into something resembling peace. Let this be a lesson, etched into the very landscape of Oakwood Estates. You do not bulldoze a land use attorney's garden. You do not mistake quiet diligence for weakness. Because when they cross that line, when they mistake your sanctuary for their playground, the response will be legally lethal, morally unflinching, and utterly transformative. This time, they picked the wrong lawn. And the roses, once symbols of violated legacy, now stood as sentinels of hard-won justice.